Because as we can all see, for these Israelites back then, the idea here now is all crystal clear. Because now, like God said in chapter 11, we see God say in verse 12 here that he will come and pass through the land of Egypt that night. He will do it. And remember, the Israelites also are there in Egypt. And so God will come. God will be the right and fair judge, executing proper and fitting judgments on sin. Because he is the Lord. That's what he says in verse 12. But then in verse 13, as for the Israelites, he won't punish them. He really won't. And why? Quote, "And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you." Right there, church, that's the Passover. Think of the scene. God is there in Egypt, executing right judgment on sin and sinners as he should, as sin deserves. He is holy. And there's Egyptian sinners in their houses, and then there are Israelite sinners in their houses. There's basically no difference in themselves. And yet, God will see the lamb's blood, and he will pass over the Israelite houses. He won't execute his judgment on them. And the reason so clearly implied here is because, church, it's because the lamb is protecting them. That's it. Or more specifically, it's because the blood is a sign for them. You can see that in verse 13. Quote, "It's a sign for them." And a sign of what? Well, it's a sign that, in fact, a judgment has already been executed in that house. A right sacrifice and punishment has already been paid. And that's the lamb. The without blemish lamb. The lamb that sustains them. The lamb that protects them. That's it. And therefore, no judgment comes to them, even though they, on their own, deserve it. And church, that's the second scene and section of ours. And really, I just hope you're seeing, I'm sure you are, that's so clearly the heart of the gospel. It so deeply is. And specifically, connecting this to our previous section and building on it, we now see that that's why the Lord will make this distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians. You get that? Because think about it. So as we said before, the distinction here can't be happening because the Israelites were so good and without sin on their own. Because they weren't. Instead, it was simply because they were God's people. But still, the question is, but why, as God's people, aren't their sins rightly punished by this judge? How is this holy God going to come so close to them as sinners, to their very door, literally, and yet not punish them? And the answer to that is why I think God had this whole Passover story happen here. Because consider this. If God just once again rescued them without this, well, then in this scene, he could have done that, but the Egyptians then maybe could have wondered why they got the punishment while the Israelites didn't. And they might have been wondering that throughout all of the plagues. But even more important than that, if God didn't have this Passover, then the Israelites could have thought that they were rescued really because they're pretty great. In fact, if you know your New Testaments at all, that's a wrong thinking that sadly became pretty common in the Jews of Jesus' day, because many of them thought that because of their Jewish lineage or ethnicity, that that's why they were God's people. And so the point is, if God finally delivered them out of Egypt without this happening here, without the blood and the lamb, then they could have thought that it was their Jewishness or something like that that made them worthy of rescue. But in short, proving that it isn't their deserving, their earning, or their ethnicity in itself, that's a big reason why God did what he did. And did it this way. It was so that they could see that yes, they too were sinful like the Egyptians. They deserved punishment because the Lord God was coming through to their very door and punishing sinners who deserved that punishment. But then, in God's plan, he also had it that, and yet when he saw the lamb, the blood of the lamb, that'd be a sign to them and even a sign to God that judgment has already happened in that household. Blood has already been shed there, and therefore God will not judge them because the lamb was judged in their place. Rather, he'll rescue them.